Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. And now, here on AMTV, we celebrate 100 years of broadcasting from the BBC.
This is BBC Television.
Hi there guys, it's Adam Martyn here, and it's finally happened. The BBC has turned 100 years old. You've probably seen it mentioned or trailered on TV or mentioned on the radio, but today, the 18th of October, is the day that the British Broadcasting Company, as it was then, was created. Now, it didn't start broadcasting until a few weeks later, but this date is often associated as being the birthday of the BBC, and it just so happens that in 2022, that birthday marks 100 years. Now, first things first, this isn't, a full-length documentary. I'm sorry if that's what you were hoping for. I just think if I was going to make a documentary to truly honour and celebrate 100 years of the BBC's life, then it would be several hours long, and I probably would have had to start working on it at the beginning of this year, and I just don't have the time. I have done documentaries that cover aspects of the BBC before, which you can check out on the channel, various brief history videos, or recent documentaries, or I Don't reviews covering their presentation. There's a lot of content about the BBC on this channel. But I just wanted to talk about this occasion and how huge this is. This is one of the world's oldest broadcasters. It's been around for as long as all of us can remember, unless you're over 100, I suppose. And, for all of us, when I was growing up here in the UK, the BBC was just always there. It was where you'd go to get your news. It was where I'd go to watch, children's shows when I was growing up. Do you know what I mean? It was just always sort of that de facto presence, sort of that one of those few consistent comforts, if you like. And the BBC, isn't, obviously this is a celebration of their birthday, but just to get it out of the way, they're not a perfect organisation, just as no organisation is. They've made some pretty big blunders over the years, whether that be in terms of programming or stuff a lot more serious than that. I'd actually recommend, there's some programmes that David Dimbleby, who is a broadcaster of several decades worth of experience, he did a few programmes looking at the BBC, sort of examining, when their stances were maybe correct or whether they acted improper, and I highly recommend those programmes. They're such interesting watches, so go and check that out for sure. Just a few more sources as well. I'd actually recommend reading this book, BBC A People's History. This is looking back at 100 years of the BBC, of course, and I'm currently reading it at the moment. I haven't finished it yet, but it's such a fascinating read if you're into the history of this corporation, so definitely pick that up if you're interested. It's available in hardback. I believe a paperback is coming out soon, and I'm sure it's also available digitally as an ebook. But yeah, 100 years of broadcasting. Of course, a lot of people think that the BBC just came around in the era of television, but of course that's not the case. It was around a good 14 years before television, or before television as we know it today. Formed in 1922, it was primarily a radio service, and even then in the early to mid to late, just the 20s in general, radio was coming in. It was becoming more of a household item, but here in Britain, I think it was still primarily used by enthusiasts, people who knew how to put these things together. They weren't necessarily buying pre-made sets. In America, radio was already booming in the 20s, but I think by the 30s, the BBC, which of course went from the British Broadcasting Company to the British Broadcasting Corporation, became a lot more familiar and became more of a common household staple. It kept audiences informed during World War II. Of course, even though the television service was suspended, the radio did continue. And by the 1950s, I'd argue even then, 30-ish years into its life, the BBC had attained its status as something that was just a constant here in Britain. More people were getting televisions, experiencing television for the first time through the BBC. Though it did have its competition, ITV did come around in 1955 to try and challenge it and offer something different. And I think throughout the remainder of the 20th century, just ask anyone who was around then, the BBC offered a whole wealth of different programming that has still to this day got a lot of affection for it, whether they be programs in the drama genre or whether they're comedies, sketch shows, talk shows, music shows. The BBC has done so much in its broadcasting life, particularly on the television. Here in the UK, it embraced the digital age in the late 90s, launching digital channels, BBC News 24 as it was then, BBC 3, BBC 4. It didn't shy away from this new medium as some other companies did at the beginning. And sure, not every BBC venture has worked out terrifically. I mean, one recent example, do you remember the BBC Store, which was like an online store for BBC content? That folded within, it felt like lightning speed. It didn't last very long, let's put it that way. But I think in my lifetime, over the past 25 years or so, I've always seen the BBC to be innovative where possible. I mean, where more so than the iPlayer. When that launched in like 2007, 2008, again, to me at that time, the concept of rewatching programs on the computer, not on a pre-recorded VHS tape or a DVD-R, actually watching programs online from the broadcaster in a high enough quality. To me, that was insane. That was such an insane concept to me at the time of the iPlayer's launch. And to be fair, given that, well, it is a free service, but I mean, not if you include the license fee, of course, which that's a whole other kettle of fish with the BBC. But I think BBC iPlayer was a lot of people's gateway into digital streaming. All when Netflix was slowly building up and all that sort of stuff, the iPlayer is such a defining achievement for the BBC, particularly in the 21st century so far. And there's so many potential avenues to cover. Like the news coverage, for example, the BBC News is seen all around the world. It seems like no matter what country you go to, you can find a way to access a BBC News service on the television or on the radio. I mean, you have the World Service on the radio, BBC World News plays in various countries around the world. And even here at home, again, when you look at the ratings, when there's a big news story going on, whether it's something big in politics or whether there's a breaking news story unfolding, whether that be good or bad, most viewers are tuning in to the BBC. And, obviously you can have different opinions about the corporation. Some people may love it, some people may hate it for various reasons. There is the whole license fee debate, which we have talked about before on this channel. Should the license fee be completely abolished? Should it be amended? Should it be revised? All that sort of stuff. But it seems, given those numbers, when those events happen, when breaking news is happening and people want to tune in, they tune into the BBC first and foremost. And it has fallen on hard times, the corporation. I mean, now more so than ever, not just with budget cuts, but just increased competition. I mean, obviously, keep in mind when, in terms of radio, the BBC held a monopoly for nearly 5 decades. It was only in the late 60s, early 70s when other official radio stations were allowed to go on the air. And on television, it had its dominance for 20 years. Well, not really 20 years. The war disrupted part of it. But up until 1955, it had a monopoly there as well. But even when competition came around, again, for over 40 years, they could regulate it. At first, they only had one competitor. Then the third channel was their own, so that didn't really matter so much, I suppose. But then Channel 4 came around, so now they have 2 direct competitors, and then Channel 5, and then the slew of digital and satellite channels. And I mean, even now on Freeview and all that sort of stuff, there's tons of channels to choose from. So the BBC, to say, even from an audience perspective and who's watching, to say it survived for 100 years and even into this digital age, must surely say something about the impact it's had on the psyche of the British people, if you like. In terms of the future of the BBC, again, it faces a lot of questions about how it's going to continue, but I think, in my opinion, as long as it does its best to remain impartial and producing high-quality content that resonates with millions of people, as it has done, then I think its future is in fairly safe hands. Of course, there's always the accusation that the BBC isn't really impartial, and you could look at that from a slew of different angles. Whether you're right-wing, you probably think it's too left. If you're left-wing, you think it's probably too right. If you're in the centre, you think it probably pivots in either direction, maybe. But I've always viewed the BBC as an impartial organisation, as best it can be in certain situations. The BBC has a tough job of being loved when it tries to cater to all kinds of people, whether that be in, belief or anything like that. But again, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying you have to agree with me on everything. But, in my life, I think the BBC has been a key part of that, certainly in terms of my access to not just entertainment, but to news, to broadcasting in general. I owe a lot of this channel I owe to the BBC in terms of their history and how I've been able to dive into that and analyze it and showcase parts of it for you guys here. The corporation is a big part of my life in that sense. And all I can hope is that as we continue through the 2020s, that the BBC doesn't lose sight of what it originally set out to do, which was to cater to all aspects or as many aspects of the British public as possible, which I think, again, it does try and do to the best of its ability. It remains impartial. It showcases a variety of content, whether that be news, drama, anything like that. And just think of all the firsts, the first main television channel, a pioneering radio service, the first teletext service in the world. You know, when CFAX came along in 1974, it was revolutionary. We all look back and laugh on it now and, you know, how simple it was, but it was a marvel back in its day. And again, I have done a documentary some years ago about that if you'd be interested in learning more about CFAX. Or the digital stuff it pioneered at the time. Honestly, as I said, if I was to do a full documentary, this could have gone on and on and on, but because I don't have the time, I just wanted to make a little video just talking about the BBC, the fact it survived 100 years, and quite frankly, I hope it survives for another 100 years. I hope it can go on and on for, you know, as long as I'm alive and generations after that as well. So in all, a very happy 100th birthday to the BBC. From my view, thank you for everything that you've given to me over my lifetime so far. I look forward to what you continue to do in the future, and you'll probably make more mistakes, as you know, as we all do, such as life, but as long as they're learnt from and the core values of what this company, this corporation means to not just me, but a lot of people, again, not just in Britain, but around the world, I hope that can continue to thrive, develop, and just be a beacon of one of, quite frankly, I'm one of Britain's greatest achievements, not just in broadcasting, but in general. To have a service like the BBC is something we should cherish. We shouldn't be chipping away at it. So here's to another 100 years, a happy 100th birthday to the BBC. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it and also subscribe to the channel if you are brand new. We'd love to have you aboard, and let me know in the comments what's your favourite memory of the BBC, whether that's something you watched on their TV channels or something to do with the iPlayer or something even further back, maybe it was a radio thing. You know, you just let me know in those comments. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
BBC Radio announces important changes. From the 23rd of November 1978, a new international frequency agreement comes into effect, and many of the frequencies used for the BBC will be changed at that time.